Today we're going to be beginning our investigation of biomes in earnest. And as an opening view, I'm showing you the forests of the island of Kauai in the Hawaiian Islands. I photographed this spot from just about the highest location on the island. And this island, by the way, these high elevation areas are among the wettest places on the planet. But we'll come back to wet places. For right now, let's take a look at someplace different. We're now looking down on Amchitka Island from 30,000 feet. Amchitka is one of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. And if you look carefully beneath that cloud cover, you see the very characteristic kind of a landscape of the Arctic tundra. Those pothole ponds and those braided streams. Let's take a closer look at what goes on here. So here we are on the ground looking at the tundra at eye level. Notice that the plant life of this area is just a low mat of little shrubby kinds of things and grassy kinds of things. Oh, and by the way, the Arctic tundra is the first biome that we are taking a look at. Now let's look even a bit closer. If we get down with our eye right on the ground, we see things like these. We see various kinds of lichens. And I hope that you recall that lichens are symbiotic relationships between algae and fungi, but they take on the appearance of distinct species in that symbiotic relationship. Also, you might see a bit of moss in this picture. Mosses and lichens, very primitive kinds of organisms, are among the kinds of dominant species that populate the surface of the tundra. In addition, there are higher plants, and we saw some of those in the last image, low shrubby plants, many of them in the blueberry family, the Ericaceae, and in addition, various sorts of grasses and sedges can be found in this environment. And that's about it. You really don't find trees here. You have a situation where the ground is frozen for much of the year, and even at the height of the summer, it doesn't thaw out much. So consequently, you have the kinds of things here that can live in this very short growing season in this largely frozen soil referred to as permafrost. Despite the rather forbidding kinds of conditions that you find in the tundra, there is a surprising diversity of wildlife. This is a black-bellied plover. It's not showing his black belly here because he's molted into his fall plumage, but he is in a group of birds called the shorebirds in the family Charadriidae, and there are some other similar kinds of birds in some other kinds of families that really specialize in living in this Arctic tundra. Those pothole puddles in streams and things like that form feeding habitat for these various species of shorebirds that take advantage of the brief summertime to come up and lay their eggs and feed on the immense variety and density of insects and other kinds of invertebrates that bloom in the Arctic in the summertime. Now, these far northern environments are also associated with glaciers, and you're looking at a glacier right here in the center of the field of view. This is a glacier in the northern Rocky Mountains of North America. And it raises another point that tundra is principally an environment of the northern hemisphere, but it can extend south in mountains as it does here. That's a point that we'll come back to later. So if I wanted to summarize the principal features of tundra, I would do it like this. If we focus first on the climate, we could characterize the climate as polar. I said we could divide that boreal climate into subdivisions, and this is a subdivision of the boreal climate. The coldest climates on the planet you find at the poles, so we can call them polar climates. And as you've seen in the last few photos, the vegetation is characteristically treeless with low evergreen shrubs, and when I say low, I mean a couple inches high, but they hang on to their leaves because in the very short growing season, it's better to not have to wait to grow leaves to carry on photosynthesis. If you have evergreen leaves, on the first day above freezing, you can start to photosynthesize. And you can also find other kinds of low plants like mosses and lichens and herbaceous things like grasses and sedges that can grow in very shallow soil and grow fast enough so that they can persist. The principal limiting factor of this environment I would describe as being that permafrost soil that I mentioned before. Soil that only thaws out a little bit at the uppermost layers in the summertime, but which otherwise is frozen. The deeper layers of the soil are frozen throughout the year. Now you might think that this is quite a wet place, and in certain ways it is. As you look down on Amchitka Island, you can see all those streams and ponds and all that sort of thing. But actually much of the tundra is not dry on the surface, but it doesn't really precipitate much in this tundra environment. It's just that the water that's there tends not to evaporate because you don't have a lot of solar energy to evaporate it. So sometimes the tundra is referred to as a polar desert. You don't get a whole lot of snow and rain and things like that in much of it. The tundra is found almost exclusively in the northern hemisphere because if you think of the globe, there really is not much in the way of landmass in the southern hemisphere. The only kinds of places that it extends into the southern hemisphere would be in high mountains, in what we call alpine tundra, places that are cold enough so that tundra vegetation develops in them. And that photograph of the glacier in the northern Rockies that you see here, that is an example of an alpine tundra kind of an environment. It is still south of the major tundra zone on the planet. One other animal we might mention here is the polar bear, which is nominally a tundra species. It's really more an animal of oceanic pack ice. Now let's move south of the tundra to the next biome that we encounter. We're looking here at the spruce fir forests of northern Vermont, which is in that biome referred to as the boreal forests, sometimes also called the taiga. That's the term that's preferred in Eurasia. It is an environment that is characterized by two major groups of trees, the spruces, and you're looking at red spruce here, which is a very widespread species in the boreal forests of eastern North America, and also firs. Firs and spruces are in different genera. The spruces are in the genus Picea, and the firs are in the genus Abies. And the principal fir that can be seen, I don't know that you can pick them out, but they are present in this picture, is a species called balsam fir, which is also very widespread in eastern North America. So let's explore this environment further. We're now in northern New Hampshire, and we're looking at a habitat that is quite common within the boreal forest. It's a habitat called a bog. Bogs are environments that develop when vegetation colonizes the edge of a open pond. In this part of the world, it's usually a very acidic and very low nutrient pond. And then over a series of years, the vegetation extends in a mat-like form over the surface of the pond. So that's what we're looking at here. Sedges and grasses and shrubs and things like that that have colonized the surface of this pond and form a layer of semi-decayed plant material interwoven with roots and so on that's referred to as peat. Now if you look at the edge of the bog, you can again see red spruces coming right down to it, but then within the bog itself there's a different species of spruce. There's a couple straggling individuals that you can see here. This is a species called black spruce, which is the typical species that you find inhabiting more mature, older parts of bogs. Now there are a whole host of animal species that are characteristic of the boreal zone. This is one, the Lincoln sparrow, that specializes in living at the edges of bogs. Now here's another species that is very typical of the boreal zone. This is a pine siskin, and as its name suggests, it's associated with evergreen trees. It's a fairly close relative of the goldfinch. Various species of goldfinches live over much of North America. This particular species is an inhabitant of the boreal zone, however. So let's summarize some of the key features of the boreal forest. It is not as cold of an environment as the tundra. However, it is still characterized by cool summers and rather long, very cold winters. Temperatures in the 20 and 30 below 0 Fahrenheit range would be typical in much of this region in the wintertime. And in the summers it tends to be in the 60s, and southern regions in the 70s would be a typical day, but you don't get the real hot weather usually that you get further south in the summertime. Vegetation is very much dominated by evergreen trees. Evergreens have the advantage, again, like evergreen shrubs did in the tundra, that they don't have to waste time growing leaves in the spring. When it's warm enough for photosynthesis to occur, they can begin right away. Especially species like spruces and firs also have this very tapered, conical kind of a shape that's very good at shedding the substantial snows that occur in boreal forests. If we had to pick out a limiting factor, I would pick out short growing season. We're still only talking about 10 weeks between first and last frost of the year. So rather short. Just enough time to do a little bit of photosynthesizing and then shutting down again for the winter. You find boreal forest in a very wide swath across the northern hemisphere. A good deal of Canada is boreal forest, into northern regions of the United States, and all across northern Eurasia through Scandinavia and Russia. It's all boreal forest. It also extends south in the mountains, and what you're looking at in this upper photo here is alpine boreal forest that you find in the Rocky Mountains of Utah. You're looking at a little marshy, boggy kind of a place here in the high elevation forests of the Rockies. And the trees that you see in this instance are different species. Looks like it's mostly subalpine fir, which is a very widespread species in the high elevations of the Rockies. One other species that is common and widespread in much of the boreal forest of northeastern North America is the blue-headed vireo. This species does extend south out of the boreal zone into some of the next biome that we're going to talk about. So if we continue south from the boreal zone, we encounter in eastern North America an environment that looks like this. Still forested, but forested by, instead of principally evergreen trees, principally deciduous trees. Trees that grow their leaves in the spring and then lose them in the fall. So this environment is called the temperate seasonal forest. This is a view of the Berkshire Plateau of northwestern Connecticut, which is very heavily forested. In the vicinity of 90% of the landscape, and much of this area is still in forest cover. But let's see what happens when we change seasons at the same spot. What a difference a season makes. This is the same spot in the wintertime. Now you will notice that in the background there are a few little patches of green. White pine is an evergreen species that does occur reasonably commonly, especially in the northern portions of the temperate seasonal forest zone. Other species of pines can invade the forests in southern regions. And even here there are a few other kinds of pines that can become locally common if conditions, soil conditions, edaphic factors as they're referred to, are present. Now, lest you think that I'm only interested in birds in terms of animal life, I thought we'd give a mammal a little equal time here. This particular mammal is a southern flying squirrel. It's a species that is much more common than people realize. It's probably as common as chipmunks are during the daytime. It's just that this animal is nocturnal, and you can see by those big eyes of his that he sees well at night. But he's not often seen because he's active only at night. However, if you do learn their voice, and they do have a very distinctive high-pitched squeak that they make, and you go out at night, you can hear that they're all over the treetops, quite active. Sometimes they will also invade houses. They like to live in people's attics. So this is very much a forest animal, and although they're called flying squirrels, of course, they're not like birds. They don't really fly. But what they do, and you can see that there's a kind of a flap of skin attached to his front legs there, and he can stretch out that flap of skin between his front and hind legs, and it acts kind of like a magic carpet, and they can glide between trees. They also have kind of a flat, wide tail that serves as something like a rudder. And since we're giving equal time to other animal groups, I thought I'd show you also an amphibian. This is a particularly interesting amphibian. This is a Jefferson salamander, which has kind of an odd distribution in northeastern North America. It's rather spotty in where it occurs. It's in the group of salamanders called the mole salamanders. They spend most of their year underground, but in the springtime they come out to breed. Jefferson salamander is a pretty good sized salamander. We're talking about several inches long, not a little tiny thing like some of those that you find in the woods, the upland salamanders, which are in a different family from this one. You'll notice also he's kind of a silvery blue color on his sides. That's typical of this species. But identifying this species can get to be rather challenging. Let me show you another one. This species is the blue spotted salamander, quite a close relative of the last one, with another kind of perplexing pattern of distribution in northeastern North America. In some places you find either one species or the other, but in other places you can find both species together, and when that happens, the species are closely related enough that they can hybridize, and they produce hybrids that function themselves kind of like separate species. The so-called silvery salamander is a hybrid species between these two, and there's one other form that's recognized as being a hybrid. But in any event, all these kinds of animals are characteristic inhabitants of this temperate seasonal forest biome. They don't live in the trees, but they live in the environment that the forest creates on the understory in the forest floor. So let's again summarize the characteristic features of the temperate seasonal forest. In climate, it is more moderate than the last two biomes we've looked at, with winter temperatures rarely getting to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. It also is a reasonably moist environment. There has to be a fair amount of rainfall in order to grow trees, and the rainfall is reasonably well distributed throughout the year in much of this temperate seasonal forest region. The prevailing vegetation are deciduous trees, and the term deciduous means that leaves are dropped at the end of the growing season in the fall. We can again point toward the growing season length as being a limiting factor, although we could also talk about the necessity for sufficient rain in supporting this biome. It's not a widespread biome around the world. It is found in northeastern North America. It was originally found in Western Europe, although much of that's been cut down. And it's found around East Asia in the vicinity of Korea. And that's about it. There's a tiny little bit of it that shows up in southern South America and southern Africa, just far enough south so that climatic conditions are such that these kinds of communities can again appear. Although again, because there's such a little amount of land in the southern hemisphere at that latitude, you don't see a widespread development of temperate seasonal forest there. One other animal to mention is the white-breasted nuthatch. It's in a group of species that we could refer to as permanent residents of the temperate seasonal forest, in that they can be found in this environment year-round. Species like the nuthatch, like chickadees and chickadee relatives, and certain kinds of woodpeckers are found throughout the year. We can also throw in some finch relatives as being members of this permanent resident community of forest birds. It isn't that these species don't move at all, because many of them do undergo short distance migrations. It's just that the species themselves are present in the environment year round. Now, if we stay at about the same latitude, but we move to western North America, where there's less rainfall, the trees, by and large, go away, and we're in a different biome, actually a much more widespread biome than temperate seasonal forest. This is often referred to as temperate grassland, although it's also called prairie. In Eurasia, it's called steppe. It's an environment that is dominated by grasses and grass-like plants, sedges and rushes, and low herbaceous kinds of species like that. One other major group is often separated out and referred to as forbs. Forbs are low herbaceous plants that tend to be broader leaved than most of the grasses and sedges. And in this photograph here, although it's primarily grass, you can see a few forbs making an appearance there. This is the shortgrass prairie of western South Dakota. It is a very different environment in more ways than just the lack of trees from the temperate seasonal forest, as we'll see. Let's take a look at some of the animals that populate this landscape. This animal is the plains bison of North America. There's actually a quite similar looking European species, although ecologically that species and this one are somewhat different. There were at one time several different subspecies of this bison, one of which was called the wood bison, which was also a bit ecologically different from the one you're looking at here. The plains bison really were, to a significant degree, specialists in this grassland kind of an environment, and once upon a time they were among the most abundant large mammals on Earth. They have, after having a population crash in the late 19th century due to habitat destruction and overhunting, made somewhat of a comeback. And they've even been domesticated, and a lot of people now keep them as livestock. But still, their numbers are a tiny fraction of what they once were when Europeans first landed on the shores of North America. They are social animals living in large herds, and for a portion of the year, the females and the males are rather separate. The females will stay with the calves in late summer, and that's what you're looking at here, is an adult female and its calf, and the males separate and go off by themselves and attempt to attract females to mate for the fall breeding season. Now, large herding mammals like these, as you might expect, have a profound impact on the landscape. They can significantly influence the nature of the grassland environment just by their grazing and by their walking on it. Now, here's one other large grazing mammal of the temperate grassland environment of North America, often associating with bison, in fact, not right with them, but in the same kinds of areas bison are in. This is the pronghorn antelope, which is a bit misnamed because it's really not related to African antelope at all. If you look carefully at his face, in fact, you'll see what he's really related to. They're relatives of goats. This is a remarkable species in that it is also one of the fastest land mammals on Earth. Not in short explosive bursts of speed like cheetahs, but it has a remarkable ability to run at a sustained high speed. With this animal, I'm going to close for today. We will be continuing on our discussion of biomes in our next episode, and we will begin that one by discussing further and summarizing some of the characteristic features of this temperate grassland environment.